Welcome to Great Cities Institute, particularly those of you that are coming here for the first time. We're very happy to have you. I'm Teresa Cordova, Director of Great Cities. We have also here one of our fellows, Marty Jaffe is one of Great Cities Fellow, and also the head of the Transportation, the Urban Transportation Center, Steve Schlickman, is also here. We welcome him and all of you to be here. Afterwards, we do have a reception planned, so please stay and join us for that. And I will at this point turn it over to another Great Cities Institute Fellow and Dean of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, Mike Pagano, who will introduce our fabulous, wonderful speaker, who is one of the jewels of UIC. And Dean Pagano is going to tell you about some of our other events coming up too. So.
Thank you, Teresa. I'm Mike Pagano. I'm the Dean of the College, and you all have these flyers. You all have these flyers. Does that work? Yeah. Be sure to come. I have a great title, Jewels of UIC series. This is wonderful. I am the dean here, and I enjoy the series that has been put together, or will be in the process of being put together over the semester. What I'd like to do is introduce the speaker today, who is Paul Brandt-Rauf. And it really is a privilege to introduce someone who never really, have you seen the New Yorker cartoon of a New Yorker's view of the world, and everything is in Manhattan, and anything beyond the Hudson is like it's way, way out there. And then but you notice they even allowed New York or Chicago to have a bit of a dot out here. Paul's a New Yorker, and after 40 years at Columbia University, 40.
Starting very young.
What's that?
Starting very young.
He was 16 when he started college at Columbia, and the list of degrees, all from Columbia, are very, for us, I think, those of us who think of planning and management sorts of things. He has a BS in Applied Chemistry and Chemical Engineering, an MS in Applied Chemistry and Chemical Engineering, a doctor of science, what's an SCD?
Doctor of Science.
It is a doctor of science in Applied Chemistry and Chemical Engineering, an MD from Columbia University, an MPH from Columbia, and a doctorate in public health.
Wow.
So you figure the reason that he's working, and he'll be working for another 30 or 40 years, is because he's got a lot of tuition to pay off. Paul is the author of over 300 publications, articles, book chapters, reports, and everything else. He's in every kind of honorary society you might imagine. And he's one of the real, I like, what is it, a jewel? A gem. He's one of the gems as well at UIC. 6 years ago, we were fortunate enough to lure him out of the trappings of Manhattan and bring him here to Chicago. And now he's stuck. He can't get out. We're keeping him here. Paul's going to speak on something that is near and dear to his heart and mind, which is also part of ours. He is one of the few people, and I hope that there'll be more and more as time goes by, few people who can bridge the East and West campuses in terms of the intellectual thought behind the work they do and the linkages that it has to, in our case, to planning of populations and settlements. He is, in fact, he does have a courtesy appointment in the Department of Urban Planning and Policy. That was his request when he first came here 6 years ago, and we're delighted that he's actually back here to make a research presentation for all of us here today. So, Paul, thank you for coming here. Thanks for being part of UIC, and thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That's a very kind introduction. And thank you, Teresa, for honoring me with this jewel designation. When I heard that, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it, because I've been here 6 years now, and every day I say I discover a new gem among the faculty and the staff and the students, and I don't view myself as being in that same category. But if you include costume jewelry in this, then I guess I qualify. So I'm just another pretty face after all. So today, yes, I'd like to talk about a subject it's going to be a long, interesting road, talking a little bit about how my research got me interested in the bigger subject of global environmental justice, and then spending the second half of it really delving into that more deeply. So you have to go through a little bit of science. For those of you who are not interested in science, you can sleep through the first half. But to get you started, to keep your interests going, hopefully, I'm going to start with the 3 Qs, because this is an educational institution. Right? So I know you're thinking of the 3 R's, right? Well, I'm a little slow. I haven't gotten up to the R's yet, but I do Q's now. So Q's, I'm going to do a quip, a quote, and a quiz. Okay, quip, a quote, and a quiz. Here's the quip. So how many of you heard the one about the Dalai Lama and the pizza parlor? Anybody heard this one? Dalai Lama and the pizza parlor. Yeah, we got one. Okay, so don't give it away. Don't even think it. Okay, don't think it. Okay, so here's how the story goes, my version of the story. So the Dalai Lama is visiting Chicago, walking down the street through Little Italy, right? And he's passing a lot of restaurants, he's reading the signs. Walks by a pizza parlor, he's reading the sign in the pizza parlor, and it says, let us make you one with extra cheese, let us make you one with dried tomatoes, let us make you one with sausage, etc. And he reads the list, he's intrigued. He goes inside, goes up to the counter and says, can you make me one with everything? Okay, good, okay. I don't have to explain it. No, that's only part of it. So the counter guy, says, of course. He goes back, comes back with the box, puts it on the counter, and says, $18. Well, the Dalai Lama's a little more puzzled now than before, but he says, okay, so hands him a 20, takes the box and goes to leave. And the counter guy says, well, what about your change? And the Dalai Lama says, no, thank you, change must come from within. Now, I want you to remember, we're going to park that to the side for a while, but one with everything, change from within, okay? That's the quip. A little existential humor, right? Okay, so what's the quote? There's another smart guy here. Dalai Lama's probably pretty smart. There's a smart guy, but he's challenged finding a good bargain, I guess. But I like this quote because the world we have made as a result of the level of thinking we have done thus far creates problems we cannot solve at the same level of thinking at which we created them. How many people agree with that? Good. Let's park that to the side. But remember, now the quiz. How many people know the trolley problem? Nobody knows the trolley problem? So there's actually now an unofficial branch of philosophy that is inhabited by trolleyologists. And the reason the trolley problem has become popular again recently is because the person who first invented the problem, Philippa Foot, who was an Oxford-trained philosopher who actually taught at UCLA, in an article in 1967, which was totally unrelated to this problem, but it was sort of one of those little asides you throw in that then starts a revolution. So she posed the original trolley problem. And the original trolley problem is like this, but not this. I'll tell you what the original one is. So the original one is you have 5 people tied to the railroad tracks down here and 1 person tied over here. And you're standing here at the switch that can turn the train one way or the other. And along comes a runaway trolley. The conductor is gone and it's just barreling down the tracks. And it's going to run over those 5 people, right? So, but if you throw the switch, you're going to save those 5 people, but it's going to hit this 1 person. So the question that was posed is, do you throw the switch?
Here's the trolley.
Now, the trolley problem then has developed a life of its own. There are about 10,000 different variations. So if those of you interested in philosophy, I think it's a fascinating one, because the next stage up is the fat man problem. And there are a couple of books that came out this past year after Philippa Foot died about the problem of the fat man. But I'm going to leave that aside, because I think those problems are really interesting but really tough. I hope this is a little bit easier. This is my version of the trolley problem. So in my version of the trolley problem, you have just fulfilled your lifelong desire to buy your expensive sports car. You're having your second childhood, many males do this, and they get your expensive sports car, and you're taking it out for the first drive in the country, and you come to a railroad crossing, and you try to go across the crossing, and what happens? Your car stalls out right on the crossing, right? You try to start it, it won't start. So you get out of the car, go walking up the track looking for help. And you run into the trolley problem, because you get to the switch here, and this trolley is bearing down on this person tied to the tracks. But if you throw the switch, you'll save the person and it will wreck your car. So what would you do? Would you throw the switch? How many people would throw the switch? Yeah, you see, okay. Now let's park that up. Remember, so you would throw this, you would sacrifice your car to save a life. Okay? Okay. Remember those 3 things. We're going to come back to those thoughts, I hope. Next slide. Okay, so what I do is environmental health. Why do I do it? Because I think it's important. Why is it important? Well, here's one reason. The environment, according to the WHO, is responsible for 24% of disease and 23% of deaths around the world, okay? So to fix the environment so that you can improve health is an important thing, I think. And that's why I've devoted my life to it. And another reason to think about it is because I think I've become fascinated with trying to sell the idea of why we should improve the environment for health's sake. So in order to do that with a lot of people, you have to make economic argument, right? So it turns out when I started looking into this many years ago, that this is not a new idea, right? So that health is related to productivity and development. The question of why some countries are poor and some countries are rich, we're going to address in a minute. And I think this is relevant because I think, as Adam Smith said many, many years ago, people who are sick tend not to work so good, and if they don't work so good, they're going to remain poor, basically, not going to be productive. And my former colleague at Columbia, Jeffrey Sachs, put it in a little bit different context, talking specifically about sustainable development, that things like environmental degradation and disease are going to cause people to be poor, and if they're poor, they're not going to work. If they're unhealthy, they're not going to work well, so they're going to be poor. And if they're poor, they're not going to be healthy, and it becomes a vicious downward cycle, right? So there's a relationship. I'm trying to build a relationship here, and I'm going to show you my example from Bangladesh in a minute, between environment, health, and development, okay? And hopefully then we will transition in a little while to injustice. Okay, so but before we talk about the global issues, let's talk about local in this case being in Bangladesh. And the reason I'm using Bangladesh is because I spent many years working there. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project there, which is what got me thinking, as I said in the beginning, about global environmental injustice issues. So, but let's start with environment, health, and sustainable development in Bangladesh. For those of you who are geographically challenged, this is a map of Asia. Bangladesh is right here. This is India. This is China. Okay, and this is what it looks like on the ground. That's what it looks like in the country on the ground. And what you can't, so it's a country with a lot of water, which is interesting, but it's water that's not so good for people, which is part of the problem. And you only see one person in here, but actually Bangladesh, which is this tiny little country here, which is about the size of, roughly, for this audience, you consider about the size of Illinois, has 140 million people. It's crowded. Even in the country, it's crowded. It's crowded everywhere. So that's part of the problem too, a lot of people. So if you look at the health, environmental health issues in Bangladesh, you can consider at least 3 different categories here. We were there particularly for a water pollution issue, which is what I'm going to spend some time talking about. That's arsenic in the groundwater, okay? But while we were there, we started looking at other issues like air pollution, which is a big issue. But we're not going to talk about that today. But I am going to talk a little bit later on about climate change because I think these two get related, and they get related to this too, okay? So the reason we were there, though, was because of arsenic. So the history of the arsenic problem in Bangladesh is very interesting because the problem, if I go back one slide, the problem with chronic, historically with water in Bangladesh is that people were drinking this surface water. And I didn't put the slides in here, but I have slides of animals defecating in the water, humans defecating in the water, people washing their dishes and their clothes in that same water, taking the water to drink. You can imagine this is not a healthy situation. People were getting diarrhea like gangbusters, and also even worse diseases like cholera, okay? So there was a substantial morbidity and mortality because people were relying on contaminated surface water, contaminated by microbes, getting microbial diseases, for their source of drinking water. So, about 40 years ago or so, WHO, UNICEF, UN decided we're going to try and fix this problem for Bangladesh. We want to wean the people off the surface water. We want to give them a clean source of water, which could be groundwater, by drilling wells. So they started by drilling a few million wells, and now there are many, many million wells in Bangladesh down here. And in fact, most of the population now, 97% of that population of 140 million, are drinking water, groundwater from tube wells, okay? So this actually made a big difference in the rate of diarrheal disease in Bangladesh. It actually dropped by about 75%. And the mortality from the diarrheal disease, which is mostly in kids under 5, almost disappeared, okay? So that's a big advance. However, and they tested the water in the wells for things like microbes. They wanted to make sure they weren't just going to get contaminated water, but they didn't test for anything else, which is a lesson to be learned right there. Because what they didn't know at the time was the groundwater in Bangladesh, in certain places, not everywhere, but in many places, is contaminated with arsenic. And arsenic, if you don't know, is a toxin. I will remind you of that in a second. So right now, we have a couple generations of population in Bangladesh, about at least 25 to 40 million of that 140 million people exposed to toxic levels of arsenic in their drinking water. Okay, this is a problem, and that's why we were in Bangladesh. Now, the why we were in Bangladesh is a little more complicated because at the time we started, this is about 15 years ago, there was a debate in this country about what the standard for arsenic in drinking water should be in this country. It's a very interesting history, I can't go through it, but there was a debate about where we should set it so that our population would be safe. It turns out that the best way to answer that question is by going to Bangladesh to study that population. There are many places around the world that are contaminated, where the water is contaminated with arsenic. But the U.S. is also one of them. Okay, the U.S. is down here. We don't really know how many people in the U.S. are exposed. And actually, if you look over here, this says the source of the arsenic. Most of the sources are natural. This is not something that comes from industry or mining in most cases. This is a natural phenomenon. Okay. In the United States, the large populations exposed are in the northern Midwest, not Chicago. Chicago's okay, so you can drink the water here. The Southwest, all of the Southwest, and northern New England. Those are the big areas. Parts of Alaska where nobody lives, things like that. Now, when we face a problem like this in this country, where do we set the standard? Normally, what we do in my profession is you take a whole bunch of animals and you give them the toxin and you see at what level they get disease, and you try to extrapolate to humans. Okay? We couldn't do that in this case because the endpoint of primary concern for most toxins, including arsenic, is cancer. And if you give lab animals arsenic, they don't get cancer. Only primates get cancer from arsenic. So you got to study either monkeys in very large numbers or humans. And if you're gonna study primates, you might as well try to study humans, so you don't have to make extrapolations. So you have to find a huge population of humans that are unfortunately exposed to arsenic in their drinking water to answer the question of what a safe level is. And you have to find a population that doesn't move around a lot, because you got to follow them for a long time. So Bangladesh turned out to be actually, unfortunately for them, an ideal place to go study this question of how toxic is arsenic in drinking water. Okay? And if anybody has questions, ask. And you can see Bangladesh, here, in the last slide I said 25 to 40 million people exposed. So this one says 30, it's in the middle. A big range of arsenic, which is what you want. What we have to do is do a dose-response curve. You want to see people that are ingesting a little bit of arsenic, a little more arsenic, and then a lot of arsenic, and you want to draw the curve to see where you would say is an acceptable level to set to protect our population. So that's why the US government was funding us to be in Bangladesh. Okay? So we went to Bangladesh. Turned out to be a rather challenging place to be, but well, first I'll talk a little bit about arsenic. Not so much the chemistry. What I want to emphasize here is, well, the chemistry is interesting because arsenic is a metalloid. So how many people have taken chemistry? Any chemistry? Oh, good. Oh, okay. So on the periodic table, you remember Mendeleev's? So there's a horizontal line across the table that separates the metals from the non-metals. But on that horizontal line, a diagonal line. On that diagonal line, things that are right on it are called metalloids because they act a little bit like either or both. And so arsenic, most people think is a metal, but it's not really. And it's interesting because what it means is it gets metabolized. We actually also metabolize arsenic, so do animals. So most metals like mercury or lead, we get in, we either store it or excrete it, but we don't change it. Arsenic is changeable. So that makes it interesting, and if I had another day to talk to you about all this stuff, I would tell you about why that's relevant, but I don't think I have another day. So most of the exposure that for arsenic comes in our population comes from food. How many people had seafood last night for dinner? Anybody? Okay. So Teresa, if I took your urine now and tested for arsenic, you'd have a lot of arsenic in it. But you wouldn't be at risk. Why? Because the arsenic in seafood is the organic form. Okay? The organic form is much, much less toxic than the inorganic form. And it's the inorganic form that occurs in drinking water. Okay? So, and the reason the seafood part of arsenic is not so toxic, it's been pre-metabolized by the fish for us, so that once we eat the fish, they've already taken care of turning the inorganic into organic. Okay? So the real source of exposure of worry is drinking water. That's in this country too, as in Bangladesh.
What are the other two, Paul?
So workplace exposures.
Are those organic or inorganic?
These are inorganic: smelting and wood treating and pesticides. That's all inorganic.
Mm-hmm.
And consumer products is inorganic too. So hopefully in this country we've gotten rid of them. Although we still use it as a medicine. It's still actually, although arsenic causes cancer, it's also one of the for certain forms of cancer, it's one of the treatments that people use. So it actually can cure cancer. Like a lot of things that are toxic, at the right dose it can cause cancer, at the right dose it can cure cancer. And we've actually done studies on that too, but for another day. So arsenic actually has a lot of health effects though, okay? So acutely, if you take a big enough dose, now nobody in the world is drinking water at the level where you're going to take it, drink it and drop dead, okay? That's the kind of arsenic levels you see when your spouse doesn't like you so much and tries to get rid of you. Arsenic and all lace type of stuff. It's a very, very effective poison, right? Because what happens with the acute dosage, large dose, your entire GI tract starts to bleed out. There's no way any medical intervention could prevent that. So once you've gotten that dose in you, you are dead. Okay, and it's not a good way to, that's how rat poison, we still use for rat poison, the same way. The rats just exsanguinate into their body. Okay? However, I don't advise this if if you don't like your spouse or your significant other, it's easily traceable. So if you want a different option, see me later. For a small price, I can advise you. Yes, but so it can kill you. Okay, but that's not what we're not seeing people dropping dead. But what we see is some interesting things. And as I said, the late effects, the one that usually drives regulations in this country standard setting is cancer. Because cancer is a stochastic event, basically. So theoretically, one molecule of arsenic can cause cancer in an individual. So we tend to, all these other things are more dose dependent. Okay. So when I say we're trying to find a safe level, we're trying to find an acceptably safe level where the number of cancers is acceptable to society. That's true for everything we regulate as a carcinogen. But so it causes a lot of cancer, a lot of different places. We'll get back to that. It causes a lot of other bad stuff too. But the first things you see, which is what was noticed in Bangladesh, is this stuff, skin changes, okay? And the skin changes, first, the color of the skin starts to change. So you get light areas and dark areas. It's been described by the poetic dermatologist as raindrops on a dusty road. So think of the summer walking in and it starts to rain. You have that light tan and all of a sudden you have these dark spots. That's what it looks like. And then after that you start getting hyperkeratosis, like warts. You get these overgrowths of the tissue localized on the skin. And the reason arsenic is really strange is because those things occur first on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Very, very unusual. And that's what an astute clinician in Bangladesh first noticed. He said, that's weird. Why is it, because these things should occur on sun-exposed areas, but your palms and your soles are not sun-exposed. And he said, see, it sounds like something I remember. He went and looked it up and said, see, it sounds like arsenic. And he said, where's the arsenic coming from? And the only thing he could think of was the water. He was absolutely right. It took about 20 years for anybody to believe him. But he was right. So that one astute person recognized the problem because of the skin changes. But by then, of course, people were also starting to see these changes. And so for those of you who don't like gory pictures, close your eyes. I have a couple slides of gory pictures. So these are what the skin changes look like. You can appreciate lighter and darker areas, and these little nubbins are the hyperkeratoses. Now what happens to the little hyperkeratoses with time is they become cancer, so you have to amputate. Because even though this cancer looks like a typical skin cancer from sun exposure, which here we would just cut off and forget about. This happens to be a very aggressive form. It will metastasize, so it will kill you. So you have to get rid of it. And so this unfortunate gentleman, you can see all the other changes, but that's skin cancer. Now one of the other things it causes is this. Spend a second on this. These neurovascular changes, it's called Blackfoot disease, because what arsenic can do is it can obliterate the arteries in your body, so particularly distally. So if the arteries to your fingers and your toes are closed, you get no oxygen to those areas, the tissue dies, so you get gangrene, and if you're lucky, you auto-amputate your digits. If you're lucky. If you're not lucky, you get sepsis and you die. So you have people with all these skin conditions like this from the arsenic exposure. And once again, we'll get back to that issue. But that's not what we regulate in this country. We regulate about the cancers. So this is a lung cancer, and that turns out to be the majority of the cancers you see. Even if you ingest it, we knew if you inhaled arsenic, you would get lung cancer. But even if you ingest it, you get lung cancer. It's a lung. This is a liver, and this is cancer. This is a urinary bladder. That's a cancer. This is a non-malignant change in the lung. These big spaces are emphysematous, so it looks like a smoker's lung from smoking. So arsenic is really bad. You don't want to be exposed to arsenic. And the other thing we wondered, we knew it was a neurotoxin in adults. We wondered if it would affect the neurodevelopment of children. Nobody knew when we started. But we kind of figured, it kind of looked like it should. So, as I'll show you, it does, actually. It's about as potent as lead exposure is, at about the same level, roughly. So that's why we're in Bangladesh. Once again, here's Bangladesh. India's over here, and China's up here. And in between them, there's a little country here called Bhutan, which we'll also mention later. So, this is one of the early maps of the groundwater distribution done by the British Geological Survey, where the cool areas are the low arsenic and the hot areas are the high arsenic. And Dhaka, the capital, is about there. And we were about 20 kilometers outside of Dhaka in an area called Ari Hazar. This is a satellite photo of our study area, okay? So in our study area, you can see here's a river runs through it, right? There's a railroad, okay? Each one of these dots represents one of these tube wells, okay? So we had a captive population in this area well, now it's the number in the study is about 20,000. So we have about 20,000 individuals who are continually being followed every year. And the wells are being continually followed every year. So the first thing to do is find the wells, test the wells. So the cool area, the cool dots are low arsenic, and the hot dots, like red and brown, that's high arsenic. So if you look at this area, you say this is exactly what we wanted. Close to the capital, so easy, theoretically easy transportation, but it could take 4 hours sometimes to go 20 kilometers to Bangladesh. And in monsoon, you can't do it at all. But anyway, what you have is a range of exposures, right? Because most people, if you live here, you drink that water. And most people stay in their village their whole life and never move, except the women who, when they marry, move to the village next door. So you can easily track their exposures to the well. And we weren't just testing wells, I should say. We were testing blood levels of arsenic and urinary levels of arsenic. So we actually know what people got in their bodies too. But the point here is you have a range of exposures, which is exactly what we wanted in a population that doesn't move, so we could follow them for a long period of time to see what the disease endpoints are. So then we could answer the question, if you're drinking arsenic at this level of water, what's your probability of getting cancer? If it's down here, and where would we say is an acceptable level? So I'm not going to go through it once again all this. This is one of the early plots showing the prevalence of skin lesions versus water arsenic in the wells. So what you can see is your risk, including skin cancer, goes up as you get more arsenic. And skin cancer is the first cancer you'll get, and then you'll get the lung cancers and the other. If you look at the other cancers, so we did get our dose response, and we made some projections. I don't want to scare you, but the level that we've now set in this country is really an outlier compared to most, because the excess risk of cancer still at the US level currently enforced is probably in the range of 1 in 1,000 excess cancers in a lifetime. So most regulations we set in this country for carcinogens for general population exposure, you'd expect 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million. So I would say what we found is even the new level that we set is not safe. But politics enters in, economics enters in. And of course, you begin to see the risk of other cancers. As I said, lung cancer is the one that is increased the most. And this is the excess risk so this is the background risk. And you might say, if you knew Bangladesh, women don't smoke in Bangladesh, so why do they have lung cancer as a background risk? That started us off on another journey to look at the indoor biomass burning, which is probably what's causing that background risk. Okay. The women and the little kids are constantly exposed to smoke from burning a cow dung, basically.
Why is the scale different?
Yeah, because the risks in males are much higher. The males tend to drink more, and they're out in the sun. There's a synergistic effect with the sun. They're out working in the fields all day. The women are not. And they smoke. So men smoke, women don't, but the women actually do smoke passively by just cooking. It's quite dramatic, actually, but that's another whole study. Interesting. And another big problem for the world. There are 3 billion people in the world who are at risk for respiratory diseases, including cancer, from burning biomass. 3 billion. That's a big number. Arsenic, probably worldwide, you're talking at most a couple 100 million. It's small. Okay, so one of the things I was interested in was looking at this burden of disease we're seeing from arsenic, because what we wanted to do was fix the problem. So if you want to fix the problem, you have to figure out how much it's going to cost to fix the problem. And if you want to sell that idea, you got to figure out how much you're going to save by fixing the problem, right? So the idea of how much you save depends on the population greatly. And so in this country, it would be a lot different than Bangladesh, as you can imagine. But if you look at these chronic disease issues in Bangladesh, right now, the cancers are increasing still, but right now this level is the level that's enforced in Bangladesh now. That was our old level here, 50 micrograms per liter, or parts per billion, okay? Now the US is at 10, so we cut it from 50 to 10, which was good because you probably went from a risk of 1 in 100 to 1 in 1,000. Okay, but as I said, that's still average. But so if you look at the current level in Bangladesh and you say how much of these chronic diseases are going to cost you in terms of discounted future earnings, you're talking about $43 million a year. Okay, that's a lot of money, but not, you're not talking big money. It turns out in Bangladesh, the big money lies elsewhere. This is so we did find that arsenic affects neurodevelopment in children. As I said, these are different scales, but here's the overall scale. So you could consider it's not our IQ scale because you can't use the same IQ test in Bangladesh, but we developed our own. And what you can see is as people drink increasing amounts of arsenic, their intellectual capacity goes down, basically. Okay? And that effect is about what we used to see with lead in this country back in the 60s. So for a population-wide estimate, you're probably losing about 5 IQ points across your population. Now, you may say that doesn't sound like much, but that's big. Okay? And it may be permanent, and it will last a lifetime because it's in young kids. So then you start adding up big dollars of this kind of future earnings, $1/3 of a billion. Okay? But that's not the biggest. What took us by surprise, a little bit, it's the skin lesions, the non-cancer skin lesions that I showed you. Why? In Bangladesh, if you work with your hands, you stand on your feet. If you can't work with your hands and stand on your feet, you don't work, right? So almost $2 billion a year is lost because of the manual labor economy of Bangladesh. Anybody know what the GDP of Bangladesh is? $67 billion. So if you add this all up, arsenic is causing a loss of about $2 billion out of $67 billion. You'd think you want to fix the problem if you could. I'll show you, we came up with some solutions, but the problem is paying for it. Even at this level of savings, the problem is paying for it. But so you can appreciate my initial point about environment, health, and sustainable development. You don't fix this problem, it's going to be hard for them ever to get out from under. Of course, they have many other problems too, like I mentioned, biomass burning, all the infectious diseases still, they have all those problems. And when you add that up, you just wonder how they survive it all. So we were interested in interventions. So this our second trip to Bangladesh. The first trip, you would never find anything. But our second trip, you go into the supermarket, right away, arsenic-free water. You could buy it in bottles, right? Capitalism is wonderful. If there's a niche, it'll be filled. But people in Bangladesh can't do this. They can't afford this. We could do it, but they can't do it. So you have to find another solution. We looked at many different options in terms of prevention. So I'll divert. I took the slides out on this, but I did mention that arsenic is metabolized, right? So it's metabolized actually by using folate, because you methylate the arsenic. So in Bangladesh, people are naturally folate deficient. So one way, after they're exposed, you can minimize the effects of the exposure by giving them folate. So that actually works. I left that out. But that's secondary prevention. What you really want to do is primary prevention, which is give them a source of water that doesn't have any arsenic in it, or anything else in it, right? So when we tested the wells, we tested for everything, right? We didn't want to make the same mistake again. And there were some interesting, other exposures that were in there, but it's a story for another day too. So when you look at remediation options for primary prevention, we looked at lots, and at least for this part of the country in Bangladesh, and probably for most of the country, we decided the best option would be well switching and deep wells. So I'll explain those. Well switching is kind of easy to explain, because once again, here's a satellite photo of our study area. So if you have an area like this, where you have good wells and bad wells, right? All you have to do is make sure that people know which are the good and bad wells, and encourage them to use the good wells, right? That's switching. It sounds easy in theory, but I'll get back to that notion that's not so easy. So how I spent a lot of summer vacations was testing wells and labeling wells. Okay, so I'm playing chemist here. And if the well was, when we first started, if the well was bad, meaning above that 50 mark, we painted it red. I don't know if you can appreciate it, but this one, I think this is the green one, and this is the red one. If it was a good well, we painted it green, bad well, we painted it red. Well, so we didn't think too far ahead, because it turns out that paint in Bangladesh doesn't last long. It lasts about 9 months. So that's not too good, because you have to be painting all the time. So we finally decided to go to something more permanent, which had a lot more information on it. So it's not just whether it's above 50 or below 50, actually what the level is and what that means in their language. And of course, the skull and crossbones is kind of universal. So that's this well switching approach. What about deep wells? Well, it turns out that when they drilled the first well, so this is a plot of arsenic level this way against depth in the ground this way. So when they drilled the first wells, as soon as they hit water, they stopped because they got water, right? And there were no microbes, so they stopped. But you can see at the level of most of the wells in the country, that's about 50 to 100 feet, you have some good wells, but you have a lot of other wells that are no good, okay? But if you keep drilling, because there are multiple aquifers, as in most places, you have one aquifer and then you have another. So there's a deep aquifer in Bangladesh, right? So if you keep drilling, down, 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 eventually you see the bad wells go away and you only get good wells. So in areas where you didn't have lots of different wells mixed together, good and bad, we decided we'd just drill deep wells, okay? And there's a long story with this too, but you can actually use some sophisticated geophysics to determine where the deep aquifer is and where to drill, basically. So, and you get a lot of help, lots of help. Because this involves running a wire about a mile long across the ground. And, oh yeah, it was fun. I learned a lot. So this is what we ended up with. So once again, here's the satellite photo. The colors of the wells are like I showed you originally, but the circles represent areas where we drill the deep well. Okay, so you can see these are all red, so you have to have a deep well. And we did surveys of the people to see how far would they be willing to walk to get to a clean well. It turns out 200 meters was the answer. They wouldn't walk more than 200 meters. So everybody in our study area is now within 200 meters of clean water. Okay? Do they use it? Well, I was just in Dyersville a couple weekends ago, right? That's where Field of Dreams is. Fascinating. But, just because you build it, they don't always come. And when they come, they don't always use it right either. So the problem is, people tend to screw things up. Human behavior is just a problem. So it turns out you got to try to educate people. Although I know, having been an educator for how many years, that doesn't always work so well either, and I'll show you that. So we realized very, very, very quickly that us telling the people that all the science of why this is bad, you're going to get cancer, that doesn't go very far. In fact, I'll digress for 1 second because it's one of my favorite stories. On our very first trip when we were scouting study areas to try and figure out where we were going to be, we were in a village. It ended up in our study area, and typical village had 2 wells. They were actually separated by maybe 100 yards, 50 yards, let's say. Okay, and one of the women in the village, the men are out working in the field during the day. We're testing the wells, so we're talking to the women, and one of the women knew English, was partially educated up to 4th grade, I think, and was pregnant. And we knew we wanted to do a pregnancy study because of the outcome of the children, right? So we talked to her all day. We told her what we were doing, why we were doing it, why we were painting the wells, and everything, and if you drink the bad water, you're going to get cancer and all this stuff. So at the end of the day, we're packing up our chemistry kit, and she takes her big pot, one of these huge pots, to go get water to make dinner. Now her hut is right in front of the good well, and the bad well is 50 yards away, let's say. Which well does she go to? She walks 50 yards across the village, fills up water, puts it on her head, walks all the way back. So we said, what word didn't you understand? And she said, that water tastes better. So my point is, us talking, probably not a big impact. Right? Somehow, didn't register. She wasn't going to believe us. So the way you do health education in Bangladesh is you hire clowns. You bring a circus to town, because what you do, it's an all-day fair. Okay, there's actually an official occupation category in Bangladesh of clown educator. So for many years, I used to joke with my faculty. I said, now I really have clowns on my faculty, but before I had some clowns. So they come in, you can imagine, there's no TV, no radio, so when they're coming in, they're going to put on skits and shows and music and food, right? Okay, everyone's going to come, right? So you capture your audience, and in their skits and shows and stories is the not-so-subliminal message that, that water, this water, okay, right? And it works. It actually works if you do it right, so. This is looking at urine and arsenic. The villages that got the education, there was a diffusion effect too. We could see that villages that weren't officially educated, the message sort of got out. But if you did the education, it had an impact. Good lesson there, and about cultural appropriateness also. So, although what I'll tell you is, if you look where we are now, we've probably brought the level down to about 75%, so it's within 25% of where it should be, but some people are either not heeding the message, or not listening to the message, or whatever. So there's still another hardcore in there that we have to crack. But now I want to start shifting gears a little bit, because I want to... So now we have the deep wells. So the question is, with the deep wells, we're going to encourage them to use the deep wells, because we want them to get clean water. How long will the water last in the deep wells? And the reason this is an issue is because the deep aquifer here, has a very low recharge rate. It's actually, the water in that aquifer is primarily glacial water from the last glaciation off the Himalayas, really. So it recharges very, very slowly. So you can't, Bangladesh, the biggest use of water that they pump is irrigation, actually, during the dry season, January, February, that's when they irrigate the fields. So about 90% of the water used out of the wells is actually irrigation, 10% is consumption. So if you use the deep wells for anything except personal use, if you're going to pump it dry in the number pretty quickly, right? So that's not sustainable. So part of the education is to tell them, the deep wells, you got to use only for for ingestion use, okay? Not for the rest of the stuff. So hopefully they're getting that message. We think they are, but that's all other things remaining constant, right? That's why I put that in there. Are all other things ever remaining constant? No. And that was driven home to us in 2004. So it turns out that no matter what we're doing now, if we don't do something about climate change, it doesn't matter what we're doing now. And that's the point. That's a big point that we're getting to, okay? So this was our, we had a facility in the capital, but we also had a field facility. This was it, okay? And you can see, typical water level here. But in the monsoon, the water comes up. And in a bad monsoon, it comes up a lot. So this is another view of our building. You can see half of the first floor was flooded, bad monsoon. These figures, you take them with a grain of salt, probably much different. The reality is probably a lot worse than that. But when, and look, this well is no longer really useful because it's being flooded with water, surface water. So what this drove home to me is, in 50 or 100 or 200 years, this is the future. It's not going to be monsoon. It's going to be monsoon all the time, 24/7, 365, right? Because sea level is rising. And already, when we start looking at the cost of climate change in Bangladesh, that's not a big number, but it's going up. And what we're already seeing is this. So and it starts with the deep aquifers first, the saline infiltration. So in the coastal areas here, the aquifer is already being infiltrated. And pretty soon it's not going to be infiltration, it's going to be covered with seawater. You know, we can argue about how fast this is going to happen and how much it's going to happen. But a lot of what we've done with climate change so far globally, we've committed Bangladesh to a major change in their aquifers, basically. And so, like I said, a lot of what we're doing when I worried about sustainability of the deep aquifer, I shouldn't have worried about it because unless we change this, it's not going to be an issue. And of course, there are lots of other problems. If you think about if the 5-meter rise actually occurs, you're going to displace about 40 million people. Where are they going to go? Right? India doesn't want them. And India will have its own problems. So, climate change will exacerbate this problem, and the countries like Bangladesh are going to be the least able to respond, and they're not causing the problem, even with their biomass burning. And with that, you know, they're never going to get on the development ladder. In fact, they're probably going to sink on the development ladder. But then, from my perspective, climate change is only a piece of the puzzle, right? This, to me, is all about an equitable distribution of all ecosystem services, including how we use the atmosphere as a waste dump for our carbon dioxide, okay? And that's what I want to talk about now. And I'm going to try and make the case that what we have now is eco-colonialism. The rich countries are cannibalizing the poor countries for their ecosystem services, and that's why they're never going to develop, or they never have a chance. That's not the only reason, but that's a major reason. So if you think globally, these are the questions I want to address. Is the developing world stuck because of eco-colonialism? And what is our responsibility to help? Okay? So an easy way, I think, or a good way, maybe not the only way, but a good way to approach this is ecological footprint analysis. How many people have heard of ecological footprint analysis? Some, but not a lot. Okay. Interesting. So everybody that goes through UIC should hear this at some point, I think. So an ecological footprint is the area of land and water ecosystems required to produce the resources that the population consumes and assimilate the waste that the population produces, wherever on Earth the relevant land and water is located. Okay, everybody got that?
Yes.
And one of the key things about ecological footprints is you can't share them. You use up, whatever you use up is gone. Nobody else can use it, okay? So if you use up a lot more than your fair share, somebody else has got to get by less. And that's where we're going. So, why is this? So, I think the way we live now, and I would assume some people will agree, but some people may disagree, our Western society basically is unsustainable the way it is constructed. It's unsustainable for both genes and means reasons, right? So genetically, organisms love to reproduce, and that includes people. And we have a population problem still. It's gonna top off maybe, hopefully only at 9 billion, so the real problem with environmental issues as I see it is, how many people are doing what? So there are two factors. How many people and what they're doing, right? So genetically, we are like a petri dish with bacteria. What happens when you put bacteria in a petri dish? They grow until they pollute themselves to death and they all die. And because they like to reproduce. We're programmed to reproduce. Even humans love to reproduce. And then there are certain societal notions that reinforce this. That, oh no, we'll have a technological fix. It's okay. We can find a way out of this. There's a problem with that. We can find a way out of some things, but not everything. So how do we get to this? It's because we are deeply conflicted. I love this one. So while the end of the world scenario will be rife with unimaginable horrors, we believe that the pre-end period will be filled with unprecedented opportunities for profit. So, and I love this graph. We are stealing the future, selling it in the present, and calling it GDP. So our time horizon is severely constrained. That's a problem because these issues have a long time horizon. But I think we're already seeing that a few years ago, people in my crowd would say, well, yeah, we got to worry about our grandchildren. Then it was our children, but it's happening now. Maybe not to us, but to somebody. It's happening to Bangladesh now. Okay, so part of the problem is all economic activity actually degrades resources. You can't escape the laws of thermodynamics. How many people know the laws of thermodynamics? Okay. There are 3 laws, actually. The way I used to teach it is, the best you can do is, you can't win, the best you can do is break even. Second law is, you only break even on a very cold day. And the third law is, it never gets that cold. So all systems run down. Summary is that all systems run down. The solar system will run down, okay? The Earth will run down. And we're running it down at a faster pace, okay? So I don't care what your economic argument is, you can't get around this. Congress didn't pass this law, they can't repeal it. It's a law. It's a physical law. So we are irreversibly degrading our natural capital. And in doing so, we are causing competitive exclusion. We already know this with other species, right? You can argue about what the numbers are, 1,000 times the pre-industrial rate, whatever, but other species are disappearing, and it's getting worse and worse. There was just an article in the paper this week about the birds disappearing, right? Okay. But maybe it's not just other species, maybe it's members of our species, right? And maybe we'll all be all members of our species eventually, but certainly the poorest will go first, okay? We think. Because the rest of us are going to hide in our, McMansions and gated communities and walls around the border until we can't ignore it anymore, and then it will get us too. You can't escape. So how can we do this? Well, we can do this because we have the money, okay? We also have the technology. But basically, it's about money. It's always about money. But I'm not worried about the money. It's what the money buys, you see. So we could look at this and say, this is disgusting. I think it is. I think it's a shame, right? That the world's wealth is distributed this way. And I just finished reading Thomas Piketty's new book, The Capital in the 21st Century. If you haven't read it, read it, because that's the way the world works. Unless you change, it requires outside intervention to make sure that capital doesn't accumulate in the very, very rich. But that's where we are now. And what are the very, very rich doing with their money? One of the things they're doing is buying ecosystem services, whether they know it or not. Because eco-footprints vary with income, okay? So the average eco-footprint per capita in a high-income country, let's say, is 10 hectares. The poorest people then have to live on a third of a hectare. Like I said, you can't share. So if I buy your share, you're stuck. Now you got money for it, but you can't live on money alone. So this is the way the world looks by ecological footprints. We are fat and happy sucking all the ecological resources away from other countries who are squeezed to death. Okay? To be a little bit more precise. So if you look at the distribution, range of countries, here's these figures, I haven't updated them, but basically about the same. We're at about 10 now for the US. So the ecological footprint per capita in the United States is about 10, okay? The world, if you took the world and divided it equally amongst everybody that we have now, right, you're somewhere around 2. So we are using 5 times, if you consider everyone should have a fair shot at equal, we're using 5 times our fair share, which means that there are certain countries that have to get by. I don't have Bangladesh on here, but Pakistan, Somalia, they have to get by on a lot less. Okay. How does this play out? Well, it plays out this way because we import, basically, okay? We have our own biocapacity in the United States, pretty big. It's a big country. It's got a lot of resources, right? We can't even live within those resources. So this difference between our resources and what we use, we import from somewhere. Canada, there are a few exceptions in the developing world. Canada and Australia are 2 of the big exceptions. Why? Because they're big countries with few people and a lot of resources. So they actually have Canada, for example, has a lot of capacity and uses about as much as we do. But they could claim that, okay, that's okay because it's all within our borders, okay? But they don't have enough. Australia and Canada don't have enough to make up the difference. And how do you know that? Look at the world. If you look at the world totally, once again, here's the footprint if it's equally distributed. Here's the biocapacity. We are already, for the whole world, exceeding the biocapacity of the world. So even though this is totally unfair, we're running down the future. Our future capital, natural capital, is disappearing. So we're not only hurting current generations, we're hurting future generations. And it's going to get worse. Hopefully before it gets better. I hope it gets better. But so this competitively excluding is another way. It's another form of apartheid, right? We are segregating out populations. The wealthy are going to do fine, and they're going to be healthier, so they'll work better and they'll be wealthier, and the poor will be sicker and work less and be poorer. And that's unsustainable. And the way I like to look at it as a public health person is how many people are we killing? How many people in this room like to think they're killing somebody by the way they live today? I don't like to think about that, but we are, all of us, in this room, okay? So, and these are the latest, I think these are from a year or 2 ago, from the UN, and I know you can't read this, but this is what it says here. So, climate change alone, now this is just part of your ecological footprint, climate change. In the US, climate change probably accounts for about 40 to 50% of your footprint, so you could double these numbers for your whole resource utilization. But just look at climate change, because there the numbers are a little bit harder. So over 300,000 people are dead because of climate change a year somewhere in the world, and 300 million are injured somehow. Their health is affected. So in the United States, we have 300 million people. So every one of us, every year, is harming somebody around the world. And every 1,000 of us, somewhere around the world, we're killing somebody. Actually not, I shouldn't say that, because we only account for 25% of the carbon emissions, right? So you can multiply that by 4. So every 4,000 people in the United States, every year is killing somebody. We're collectively killing somebody by the way we live. Okay? That's, like I say, for a public health person, this is not good news. And it's going to get worse. you can bet it's going to get worse. So my friends, the economists, have said, no, the third world will just grow them to our size, right? Well, there's a problem with that, like I said. So if the world's entire population enjoyed the same lifestyle as us, it would take at least 4 additional Earths now, and that's going up and up and up. We've already surpassed our carrying capacity. And I think right now, today, we're at about 150%. So we need 1.5 Earths right now to do this. But really, it's a lot worse than that. And as I like to say, good planets are very hard to find in this neighborhood, or any neighborhood. So, if you think space travel is going to solve it, I don't think so. Not soon enough. So we have to change, right? So change, right? If you want to be one with everyone in the world, I think part of our growth as human beings our moral growth is to expand our circles of empathy, as Peter Singer likes to say. So, yes, we care about our family, yes, we care about our community, yes, we care about Chicago, yes, we care about Illinois, but there's people dying in Bangladesh, we don't really care. Because if we cared, we wouldn't be doing it. So we have to think more broadly. And we have to change how we live, big time. We have to change big time. Okay, that's very depressing, right? Well, don't be depressed. I don't want to depress you. Because I want to make a case that this does not need to be as painful as it seems, okay? And why? For 2 reasons. One, all the money we have doing all this stuff that we're buying is not making us feel any better, not making us happier, okay? And actually, that's so subjectively, I don't think it's buying us what we really want, happiness, if that's what you want. Most people would like to be happy. And and there are lots of studies to support that. I'm not going to go through these now. And it's not helping us objectively, because if you look at our health measures, as you get richer and richer and richer, the curve plateaus very quickly. And actually, I would make an argument that it starts to go down. So what are we doing in this country? We're using our money to buy things we don't need, that are going to, like too much food, that are going to kill us with obesity. At the same time, we're starving part of the world to do it. That doesn't make sense, right? Doesn't make sense. So objectively and subjectively, we would be better off if we didn't do what we're doing. And the rest of the world would be a heck of a lot better off. Okay, so the good news and the bad news. A lot of this, in terms of carbon consumption, we could fix right now. But there are people who don't like to change and whose vested interest with a short-term time horizon won't change. So the ecologically necessary is politically infeasible, but the politically feasible is ecologically irrelevant, and we have to change. So, I don't know if any of you have seen this book. This was actually written by a professor of public health at the University of Maryland. So if you're interested in this idea of what gets you happiness, and it's got a lot of good data in it. But the rest of the world has been catching on. Some of it sooner than the rest of the world, and that's why I mentioned Bhutan. How many people have heard of the Bhutan Happiness Index? Yes. Okay, a few.
It has the lowest ranked FIFA football team in the world. Did you know that?
But they're still happy. They're still happy. In fact, there's an equation here for the happiness index. It includes money. Money, is important, but only up to a point. And it's not the only thing that's important, right? We, unfortunately, tend to think it's the only thing that's important. So, the happiness index was actually put forth by the former king of Bhutan about 25 years ago now, quite a while. Because he said he wants to develop Bhutan, but he realizes that it's not all about GDP, right? He wants his people to be happy. And I've been there, and I have to say, most people seem happy to me. Of course, it's a beautiful place, and it's not too crowded, and they're quite homogeneous, mostly. But anyway, the point is, people have been thinking about this for a long time, maybe probably even before Bhutan. Yeah, and more recently, some of the powers that be, when Sarkozy was president, he actually convened a whole panel, including one of my other colleagues from Columbia, Joe Stiglitz, to come up with a better way to measure the progress of France, for example. I think after he was gone, that sort of fell by the wayside. But we all have to start thinking this way, and we have to pressure the powers that be to change that, because we have to change the economics and politics, the way we think about it. Because I would say progress and prosperity cannot equal growth and consumption, particularly unlimited growth and consumption in a limited world. Okay? So, I'm nearing the end now. And since Halloween is coming, I like that one. So perhaps we are the scariest costume in the room, because that's all of us. We wear the big carbon footprint. And the good news, so that's bad news, but the good news is actually here, Pogo. I'm sure you've all seen this before. We've met the enemy, and he is us. So we are the problem. All we have to do is change to fix the problem. That's all. We can fix it, because we are the problem. So we have to decide, there's the potential that we could actually go off a cliff, a catastrophe. And that could affect the whole species, the human species. We could disappear, it's possible. Or we can become enlightened and say there's a better way. We could all be happier, we could all be healthier. And we should feel a lot better about ourselves. So, your homework assignment, since this is an educational exercise, is to take this home and answer these questions. You can grade it yourself and then call me and tell me how you did. 2 questions. Okay? Thank you. And I'll entertain any questions now.
Did you ever connect us back to the clip?
To
The clip?
the quip.
Yeah.
One with everything, one with everyone. Everything would be good, but at least one with everyone, right there. We are killing people in the world that we don't see, but we should be one with them. And what we have to do is change from within to be one with them, right? And it requires a new level of thinking, like Einstein said. You can't just keep doing what we're doing. We can't have developing countries follow our model and grow out of it. It doesn't work. There are limitations, okay?
Questions and comments?
And you said, you all agreed, you'd sacrifice your car to save one life. You agreed to that. That's what I'm asking you to do. Or something equivalent. There are many websites out there, I didn't put them up here, but there are many websites where you can go, you can calculate your ecological footprint, and it's like a game, it's like a video game. You can tinker with this. For example, I'm a vegetarian. Why? Because by doing that, I decrease my ecological footprint by half. Okay? And in fact, with the reception, I should have insisted that we all eat vegetarian. That would have been good.
But not vegan, we have cheese.
No, cheese is okay. Got to be sustainable. Cheese is sustainable. But, so my point is, you can go on, there are several different websites. You can go and you can see if I change a little bit here. If I walk more and drive less, what happens? You know, if I eat differently, what happens? If I live in a smaller, one of the best things you can do, 3 things you can do. Vegetarian, drive less, and live in an apartment instead of a house. Okay? I just bought a new car, I got a hybrid, because I know that's good, right? I still live in a house though, so I gotta, I talk to Mike all the time. Why is the built environment important? Because densified populations are the best, because buildings are a big part of your ecological footprint. So if you live in a single family house, that's very ecologically unsound. The greenest part of the United States is Manhattan, where I used to live. Then I came to Chicago. I like Chicago, but Chicago, as cities go, is not that bad, right? Because it does have a good public transportation system. We can argue about that, but better than a lot of other places. But there are other cities that are just horrendous, of course. So there are things you can do, and if you don't like those options, go and see what the other options are. Change the way, and think about it. If you don't do it, you're killing somebody. You're killing somebody. It's very bad. Yes.
So I actually will put in a plug here for the Office of Sustainability.
You should, indeed.
And we do have links to footprint calculators on our website, sustainability.uic.edu. And also an event that's coming up here at, in the same room about how it's an energy panel. And you'll hear lots of ideas about what you can take home with you, whether it's energy efficiency, putting solar panels on your roof, getting your home retrofitted to be more energy efficient. So even if you do live in an apartment, in a house, you can at least reduce your footprint. So those things are on our calendar also at the website. I don't remember.
And I would say that's great, and everything any individual can do is good, but we also have to change, did you distribute that paragraph I gave you that sort of summarized what we have to change the 3 I's. I like 3 things like Q's, but so individuals, institutions, and ideas. So I dealt with ideas and individuals, but we do have to change the institutional framework in which we operate. So that requires concerted action. You can't just go to a website and do this. We have to get together and demand that we change the way politics and economics, at least what we can control in this country, if we can control it at all. So yes, change your life, please do that. But don't stop there. It probably will not be enough to save us all in enough time. I'm worried that we're going to go off a cliff. And I think there's a real possibility. If you want to read another interesting book, read 2052, which is written by Jorgen Randers, who wrote the original Club of Rome report, The Limits of Growth. So he looks back 40 years and how good their predictions were, and he looks ahead 40 years. His bottom line is 40 years, we probably have another 40 years, don't worry, you don't have to worry about that. But after that, it's a very good book. It's interesting. He says learn Chinese, for example, don't buy oceanfront property.
Well, speaking of oceanfront property, what about the Great Lakes? Marty, do you have any comments or anything you want to add?
20% of the world's open.
Yeah. And people already want poachers, right? Right?
More comments and questions?
Yes.
I don't know how to phrase this because I'm
want to ask you a question about Congress, which everybody laughs about. That's part of the problem.
That is the,
We
yes.
don't have a Congress that works, but if we did, what would be your agenda for them?
Well, I mean, most of the initiatives have focused on the carbon issue, which is important, but, I would extrapolate that once again to ecosystem services. Can we have a cap and trade on ecosystem services? Can we tax ecosystem services? We should certainly be doing that with carbon. I mean, there's so many, if I read the New York Times all the time, there's so many good editorials every week on how, taxing carbon is good for everything, for our national security, for our economy, for our well-being. So that seems to be a no-brainer. But I would actually extend the arguments, many of the economic arguments that meant, strictly for carbon to all the rest of this. Like I said, carbon is not the majority, it's close to the majority probably in this country, but there are lots of other things we do that are just as bad. Why don't we, if we could get to that point with carbon, then we could, maybe extend it to these, the other issues. And of course, one of the roots, of course, is income inequality and capital inequality around the world. That's why I encourage you to read Piketty's book. But and he has some ideas, but I don't think his suggestions are realistic for a world regulation of capital flow. Basically, would be hard to see hard to envision how that would happen. But I mean that if we didn't have so much money, then we wouldn't be doing these things. And if we didn't have it, we'd be sharing with people who really need it, right? Well, and there's a good argument. I mean, I have another lecture all on the money flow argument. I mean,
We tend to act think legislatively to crisis.
Yeah.
Can we wait for a crisis to happen to get action out of Congress or the legislature, or will that be too late?
Well, the climate scientists are worried about a tipping point where you go off a cliff, basically, right? And I'm worried about that too, right? So if that happens, there's a disaster, but it's too late to reverse a lot of this already. I know a lot of people say, well, don't give up, and we should be doing things to slow the process. But it is true, a lot of this is going to happen anyway. If the West Antarctic ice sheet falls off tomorrow, well, there goes a third of Bangladesh and Manhattan. We'll be fine here. Your property values will go up. So, but so that kind of catastrophic event, shutting down the geothermal circulation in the ocean, so Europe goes into a deep freeze and the rest of the world broils. I mean, it's those things can very easily happen. When? I don't know. But you want to wait for that. Then it's probably really too late to do anything meaningful. So, but a lot of good economists are coming on board saying it doesn't require that much investment, and the downside is big. It's like insurance. You want to buy insurance, and you look at the risk versus the investment to prevent the risk. And a lot of people, I think, are coming around finally to the notion that it's worth the investment. Now, that's half the battle, but getting political action to move on that basis,
Can I extend Steve's question as part of the fallacy that nationalism is going to be part of the solution? You need to come up with something that works at it at a little bit more holistic level than waiting for Congress in one or any individual country to come up with enlightened policies that will have the impact that you're looking for.
well, I'm not sure so we do have international trade agreements where you could factor these things in, but they still have to be approved by the countries, which then you get back to the national legislatures to deal with it, so. Like I say, Piketty's notion of some international body that's going to regulate capital flow, or Peter Singer's notion of one government for the world. I don't see it happening in my lifetime.
I mean, they had agreements on ozone.
When my students get really depressed, I say, but we can fix problems. We have fixed problems like this, and Montreal Protocol is a good example, right? Right. So why can't we do it now? Well, it's different times, and it's a bigger issue. There are more people have a vested interest in not fixing this than they did not fixing the ozone problem. And the ozone problem, yes, was an issue, but it's not nearly as dangerous as this in my mind. But you're right. It's an example of don't give up hope, because we were able to do something. So yes, maybe we can. I don't give up hope. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't be standing up here. Right. But it's a tough battle. Yes.
So the economy is a really important global force that kind of is careening us off of this cliff. It's a little bit bigger than nations now, right? Most nations have subscribed to our economic order. So what are some of the things that we can do as citizens, as nations, to help train the economy to begin to factor in the true cost of like environmental degradation?
Yeah, like I said, I think some of the more progressive economists now are working on models like that. It's all about internalizing the real cost of everything, right? So that people at least see it, so they know that what they're paying for. So that's an old notion. I mean, that's been around environmental issues and others for a long time. But fact, you have to think a little bit. Most of the, like I say, you have to think about the whole picture of ecosystem services. I don't think anybody's tried to factor that into an economic model. But it could be. I'm not an economist, fortunately, but I do understand the power of an economic argument, right? So I think it can be made, and I think there are. I mean, Joe Stiglitz is one of the economists I know who's thinking about this problem. But there are lots of others. I do have a paper I wrote, sort of summarizing a lot of this with some of those notions in it, and how you change other institutions. I think religious institutions have to step up more because people do care about religion. And it does move them, right? In fact, what I'm thinking of doing in Bangladesh is a religious intervention. That hardcore 25%, well, you know what really matters to those people? They pray 5 times a day and they go to mosque every Friday. So if their imam says you better drink the clean water, so if their imam says, or the equivalent around the world says, you're killing people and our religion doesn't believe in that, so you better stop, change your ways, like what would Jesus drive? You've seen that campaign, I think, right? Right? The answer is he'd probably walk. So that's a good lesson. But anyway, so there are lots of other extra governmental institutions that can be brought to bear, I think, but it has to be organized. Yes.
And I know, so in the title of this, justice was included, environmental justice. So what kind of things can people do in order to bring justice to the fact that, my actions here is literally killing somewhere else? Like what kind of cases can be brought forward? What kind of things have people tried in
well, you have to ask yourself, what do you think your fair share of the world's resources are, right? As I said. I mean, I would start with the premise that we should divide it equally and try to live within that. That would be very hard to do overnight from where we are now, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't start. Right? So that's the argument I would make, that what is justice fairness, and is fairness an equitable distribution? And we can debate that, but I think John Rawls would say that that's true. Okay, so well, he's dead now, but if he were here, he would say that's true. I think a target should be trying to live within the resource that's. However, another way to solve so as I started saying, there's two issues: how we live and how many of us are living that way. So there is still a population problem in the world, I think. So even if we top out at 9 billion. That's way too. I think it's way too. We have to have eventually a decrease in population, I think, and we may get that naturally. And the best way to do that, I think, without coercion, is to empower women. Right? When you empower women, politically, economically, educationally, socially, they tend to have smaller families, and that's been shown in many countries. And so the real population growth is in those countries that need it, but there are countervailing forces. In many cases, religion works against it. That's why I say, well, get religion on board. Can't they see that this is not good? And that it can't be, that the religious argument can't hold up. But yes, so that's putting the burden on mostly on the developing countries. But we can't wait for them, right? Especially since we are causing the problem. So we need both. We need this give and take where we say, we should change and we'll live within our means, but you have to try and help us by empowering your women so that your population shrinks. That's one way to shrink population. I could make the argument, we could be more coercive, right? It would have to be nationally, but China did it, right? Saying one child, right? Kind of worked. And who says you're entitled to 2 children anyway, right? How many spouses are you entitled to? We legally say you're only entitled to 1 spouse. So we could legally say you're only entitled to 1 child, or not, or none. I'm being a little provocative here. But my point is, there are many ways to attack the problem. I think we have to attack it every way. So we have to try to control population growth as much as possible and actually shrink it, but we have to shrink our lifestyle. because it's not good. It's not even good for us, that's what I'm arguing, it's not good for you, yeah? Yes.
Well, would capital in the 21st century resolve this issue that in 40 years, we will all be impoverished, while the 0.1% will be enriched, and therefore all of us will be consuming less, because you can't afford it.
Well, that unfortunately may be true. I think then you reach a point of some political instability where
Right.
people right, then the gated communities and your alarmed McMansions, I mean, your border fences are not gonna make a big difference.
Well, and they've already got bunkers in their building, right, on the ground.
Yep.
And I think, Marty's kind of comment does lead to a question around not just Congress, but the capital interests here, right, the big moneyed interests.
Yep.
Because part of why there are so many people in this country who don't even believe that global climate change is happening or believe in the reasons why it's happening, if they do acknowledge it, they don't say it's human cause, right? But part of it is because they become in this sort of ideological arm of a very strong set of moneyed interests, right? So we can all make our changes, right? But meanwhile, we're really up against these interests that are still very much engaged in emitting carbons. Now the hydraulic fracturing right now is increasing, not decreasing. I mean, there's all these ways that profit and money is being generated at the expense not only of the environment, but all of us, right? So I think besides lifestyle changes we might make, how do we get them to make changes
Vote
in their
with your
lives?
dollars, right? Market forces can change the market. And vote with your vote. I think we still theoretically live in a democracy, right? $1, one vote, isn't that right? So, oh, I'm sorry, one person, yeah, yes.
Well, no, I never, since I'm denied it, right, I mean, it's not even $1.
But there are, you can bring to bear market forces. We've done it in other cases, right? You didn't like apartheid, you don't patronize South Africa, right? This is apartheid, eco-apartheid. Yes.
So there are also, you were talking about externalities and pricing and how that globally it's hard to do, but we have externalities that we can control here with our own policies that we refuse to do. One of the major reasons we have such sprawl is because the externalities associated with transportation grids that are primarily roads, that's an internal issue.
Yeah.
I mean, you talked about the densification of cities, you have a smaller footprint, but that's not where we as consumers have been sending our money. We've been sending the legislators. We've been sending legislators and telling them to build more roads.
Build more highways,
right?
I know. Big mistake.
Yeah.
You could say we made a big mistake, sort of subsidizing an automobile economy, but at the time it would be hard to really, you have to be pretty bright to figure this out then. But now, why can't we change?
We can do that because the price of externalities is not figured into the
Correct.
cost that we're paying, right?
Correct.
So if we tripled and quadrupled what we're paying for gasoline, right?
I would totally be in favor of that.
And overnight you would have instantaneous changes.
Yeah. If we charged, like in Europe, even, $8 a gallon or so, right? People would change. Yeah, well, we got still a lot of questions.
Well, similarly, and maybe this gets a little bit to the environmental justice issues, I was thinking about the cost of the products we buy in America that are coming from other places, and then so much less because wages are low, because they don't have the environmental laws we have. So that as bad as we are in that sense, there's no cost, there's a lot of externalities that are being left out because, internationally there is no common price for labor or for the pollution that is caused, the restrictions on that, so that drives our economy to be very consumer oriented because we can buy a lot of stuff for cheap. But at the same time, we're causing harm just in that without even thinking about the issues we have.
What sort of receptivity does the notion that you're pushing of the need to change coming from within, have when you take it to a non-Western audience? The question being, there's certainly been talk of the ethical component of the developing world saying, well, we caused this problem, now since we have, and now that we can quantify the impacts, and the urgency for change, now that you all are just starting to get into the game, we're gonna impose from the problem makers the need to change. How is that argument going over?
Yeah, well, no, it's always thrown back in the face, you know, and if you believe in sort of the polluter pays argument, we're the polluter primarily, and we should be paying. And a lot of it, actually, I was just at a conference about low-lying island nations, and which are going to disappear, right? Maybe not in 40 years, but certainly some of them in 100 years. Where are they going to go, and who's going to pay for that? Well, they're saying, you caused the problem, we're going to lose our whole country, you should pay. Meaning, you know, United States and Western Europe and Japan. I think it's a pretty good argument. On the other hand, there are things we have now, they don't have to go through the same growth cycle we went through, because we went through sort of a dirty polluting cycle to get where we are. There are technologies that are much more efficient, so they can actually improve themselves with much less pollution, and that's happening in many places. So, in fact, a good example of that is the stove problem in Bangladesh. So, the reason they have that air pollution problem is because they cook on an open hearth, three-stone hearth, right? So actually 85% of the energy that they're using is wasted, it's only 15% is used for cooking, and the rest is heating the planet, basically, okay? So if you give them a stove, you flip those numbers. 85% is used for heating and only, so, you know. So, and they're healthier, right? Now, once again, getting them to use it and the right way requires a lot of effort, right? But that's an example of a win-win, right? You give them technology where they can actually do better than they're doing now, be healthier than they are now, and pollute less. Right? So that's the kind of thing we have to do. But we should be subsidizing that.
Well, after you laid out this multi-year career commitment, right, and this research that you've done in Bangladesh, you had said, well, none of this matters, though, unless we deal with the issues of climate change, right? So I don't think that's to say necessarily all those things don't matter, but or that we shouldn't pay attention to those other things.
No, of course not.
But what I take from that is everything else that we do, we really need to think about it in the terms of the sustainability and the issues around their impacts on climate change. So whether it's the world of economic development, rebuilding neighborhoods, affordable housing, urban design, right? All of our policies really then ought to then be thinking about how do we incorporate some of the issues around how do we fight against eco-colonialism? How do we reshape that and not only make ourselves accountable, but our policymakers and those corporate entities that are refusing to get on board with this. So to that degree, you have provided us much to think about, much research, and I think you've been very inspiring, and you are indeed a jewel of UIC. And with that, unless we have more comments or questions, we do have reward outside these doors waiting for us by way of both some vegetarian, I don't think we actually ordered very much meat, it's we do have refreshments, and we do have wine and beer. So if you may want to make some final wrap-up comments, Paul, or
Just
Dean.
want to thank you all for coming, but I hope you take the message to heart and do something to change your life.
Thank you.
Thank you.